Hey guys, welcome to Journey of Relaxation. Tonight, we drift into the soft glow of a Victorian night sky, where gas lamps flicker dimly in cobblestone streets, and the faint rustle of hoop skirts blends with the whisper of distant church bells. Imagine yourself draped in wool and lace stepping quietly into a room lined with thick velvet curtains and curious scientific instruments gleaming in the candlelight. The stars above twinkle vast and indifferent, while below, women with sharp minds and secret dreams are turning their gaze skyward. Only you probably won't survive this trip if you expect a straightforward tale. The women of the Victorian era, confined by strict social codes and the stifling expectations of proper womanhood, found ways to train themselves as astronomers in shadows and whispers, often denied public recognition, but never quite deterred. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments. It's fascinating to see where in the world we all are united under the same stars. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin your Victorian adventure amid a social landscape where a woman's place was firmly fixed home hearth and society events ruled her hours. Scientific pursuits, especially in fields like astronomy, were considered the province of men, the public sphere, where intellect and formal education flourished. Yet beneath this rigid surface, a quiet curiosity began to stir among women. They noticed the stars, the planets, the moon's phases not just as poetic symbols or decorative motifs on china, but as objects demanding observation, calculation, and interpretation. This curiosity was not merely idle daydreaming. The Victorian era, bursting with scientific advancements and imperial exploration, heightened public interest in the cosmos. Popular lectures, illustrated magazines, and books on astronomy circulated widely, often aimed at family audiences, which paradoxically included women even while discouraging their formal involvement. Historians still argue whether this encouragement of amateur study was a genuine invitation or a clever way to keep women out of professional scientific circles by confining their work to the hobby level. You can almost smell the thick paper of the Victorian star charts and hear the faint scratching of quills as women copied celestial coordinates by candlelight. It was a world where telescopes were bulky, expensive contraptions, and yet some women managed to get their hands on them, or at least study the skies through borrowed lenses. Oddly enough, Victorian women's engagement with astronomy often intersected with their socially accepted roles, teaching, illustrating, or managing household scientific instruments. For instance, many learned about celestial navigation indirectly through family members in the navy or merchant trade. Some even studied mathematics discreetly at home, the forbidden fruit of female education, to understand star tables. There's a quirky detail here. Some women used the prevailing fashion of the day, elaborate star-studded embroidery on gowns, as a secret code for sharing star patterns. Imagine embroidering the night sky on silk, blending art and science, and passing the finished piece to a friend who could decode it. Not exactly Tinder for astronomers, but a discreet way to share knowledge. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we talked about in another story? Well, Victorian women sometimes repurposed botanical inks for marking star charts, blending their domestic skills with scientific passion. It's an odd crossover, but it highlights how these women navigated their worlds creatively. You begin to realize this wasn't just about gazing at stars. It was about carving out a hidden space where intellect and curiosity could survive social strictures. The silent stargazers weren't just romantics. They were pioneers, often teaching themselves, often risking social censure. By the end of this opening glimpse, you can feel the tension, a world encouraging science and progress, yet gatekeeping who could join. Victorian women's astronomy started as a quiet rebellion marked by self-study, coded communication, and the occasional covert glance through a telescope perched on a dusty windowsill. The quiet beginnings you just sensed quickly blossomed into secret societies and study circles, gatherings of women who shared not just gossip and tea, but also star charts, calculations, and burning questions about the heavens. Picture a dimly lit drawing room somewhere in London, or a small town parlor where a handful of women armed with notebooks and telescopes smuggled in trunks huddle around flickering candlelight, whispering about eclipses and the mysterious canals on Mars. These weren't your typical social clubs. They were intellectual sanctuaries carved out in a society that didn't quite believe women should wield scientific knowledge. These secret circles often formed under the radar, sometimes disguised as ladies' reading groups or needlework clubs. The need for discretion was paramount. Women who openly declared themselves astronomers risked social ostracism, or were simply ignored by the professional scientific community. You can almost hear the rustle of petticoats as these women passed around copies of the latest astronomy journals, carefully annotated with their own observations. These gatherings were places to share not only knowledge, but also the frustrations of being locked out of formal education. A mainstream historical fact here is that several of these women's groups were linked, however indirectly, to learned societies such as the Royal Astronomical Society (RAS). While the RAS officially excluded women from membership until 1915, some women managed to influence the society's work by submitting observations through male intermediaries. Historians still argue whether these early women's efforts were recognized as genuine scientific contributions or dismissed as amateur dabbling. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some of these secret circles used code words and ciphers to communicate sensitive scientific information. It was partly practical, sending letters that might be read by curious family members or servants, but also playful. One particular women's astronomy group reportedly referred to the planet Venus as the evening jewel and coded observations of star brightness in floral metaphors. Imagine getting a letter about the blooming of night lilies and knowing it really meant a star's sudden flare. Some study circles expanded into correspondence networks that reached beyond Britain, connecting women astronomers across the Atlantic. They exchanged star catalogs and even early photographic plates, building an underground web of knowledge. It was a time when letters traveled weeks or months by ship, yet the commitment to sharing discoveries was unyielding. You can sense the atmosphere in these meetings, part clandestine science lab, part literary salon, where women encouraged one another, debated theories, and meticulously recorded observations. These circles became both emotional support systems and intellectual hubs, a stark contrast to the isolation many felt in their daily lives. One thing that often goes overlooked is how these groups balanced scientific rigor with social norms. For example, many meetings started or ended with tea and knitting, blending accepted feminine activities with rigorous data discussion. This balancing act was a form of rebellion itself, proving you could be both a lady and a serious astronomer. At the same time, the men who dominated official science circles were not always hostile. Some gentlemen astronomers became covert mentors or allies, providing access to telescopes, sharing books, or even publishing women's work under their own names, a bittersweet form of recognition that could be both a help and a hindrance. The etiquette of the day made direct collaboration tricky, but it also fostered a network of unofficial mentorship. You might chuckle imagining a stern Victorian man quietly tipping his hat to a young woman, whispering, "You have a keen eye for the stars," while the lady's mother watched from behind a curtain, worried about propriety. This dance of encouragement and restriction defined much of the era's gender dynamics in science. The real magic of these secret societies and study circles was how they kept alive a flame of curiosity, passing knowledge like a whispered secret from one generation of women to the next. They laid the groundwork for the breakthroughs and public recognition that some women astronomers would achieve decades later. As you let this sink in, remember every whispered conversation about the stars was a small act of defiance, a step toward a broader universe where women could claim their rightful place among the constellations. You step now into the murky but fascinating world of the gentlemen astronomers, who, despite prevailing Victorian norms, often became secret champions for these aspiring women stargazers. Imagine a stately study with walls lined by leather-bound volumes, where an older man adjusts his spectacles as he reads a carefully worded letter from a young woman sharing her celestial observations. This wasn't your typical mentor-mentee relationship. It was a complex dance of social expectations, subtle encouragement, and sometimes cautious collaboration. Many Victorian male astronomers, especially those involved in amateur astronomy societies, quietly provided access to their observatories or loaned expensive equipment. They sometimes published women's findings under their own names, or more kindly their initials, to shield the women from public scrutiny. Historians still argue whether these men were truly allies, or if their actions perpetuated the erasure of women's contributions by keeping them anonymous. A mainstream historical fact: figures like John Herschel and William Lassell, prominent male astronomers of the time, reportedly corresponded with and supported female observers, acknowledging their skill and dedication. Some even invited women to participate in data collection, albeit discreetly. Yet official societies such as the Royal Astronomical Society barred women from membership until well into the 20th century. creating a paradox of support and exclusion. There's a quirky detail tucked in here. Some gentlemen astronomers kept women's observations in personal diaries coded in shorthand, or obscure symbols, almost like secret recipes to protect their value. One diary discovered in recent years contained references to a Miss Starling whose notes on variable stars were recorded with meticulous care, but never published under her name during her lifetime. Imagine that, a hidden ledger of female genius waiting quietly in a dusty attic. The mentorship often came with strings attached, though. Women had to navigate a fine line between accepting help and maintaining independence. Some were reluctant to have their work filtered through male intermediaries, fearing misinterpretation or outright dismissal. Others embraced the chance, knowing it was one of the few routes to visibility. You can picture a young woman carefully packaging her handwritten star charts, her hands trembling as she sends them off with a hopeful note to be kindly considered. The responses might arrive weeks later, with technical advice, gentle corrections, and encouragement to persevere. It was a slow, indirect form of collaboration, often conducted through layers of social etiquette. Some men went beyond simple mentorship. There are stories of astronomers who lobbied their peers to recognize women's observations at scientific meetings, though often these efforts were downplayed or quietly ignored. Historians still debate how effective these behind-the-scenes champions were in changing attitudes or simply maintaining the status quo. Another amusing image: a male astronomer frustrated by the rigid social rules reportedly joked in a letter about teaching stars to ladies who can outcalculate the gentlemen themselves, though they must not be seen doing so. It's a reminder that even in rigid times, wit and irony found their place among those who loved the stars. You start to understand that these gentlemen astronomers were both gatekeepers and guides, navigating a complicated web of social norms, while sometimes risking their reputations to support women's intellectual ambitions. Their relationships were often private, fraught, and full of unspoken rules. Through these quiet alliances, Victorian women astronomers found glimmers of hope, tools to sharpen their skills and pathways to make their work known, even if only in whispers and footnotes. You now find yourself in a cozy attic or a sunlit parlor, where a brass telescope points through a slightly fogged window, its lens aimed at the mysteries of the night sky. These home observatories were the secret fortresses of Victorian women astronomers, tucked away from the skeptical eyes of society. Imagine the scent of polished wood mingling with the faint aroma of lavender sachets, while your fingers trace the delicate brass knobs as you adjust the telescope's focus, your heart pounding with the thrill of discovery. Despite the high cost and bulk of telescopes in the 19th century, some determined women managed to acquire their own instruments, either by purchase inheritance or through the generosity of male relatives. Setting up a personal observatory wasn't just a matter of vanity. It was an act of defiance and self-determination. Many of these observatories were modest, sometimes little more than a converted attic or a garden shed, but they provided crucial access to the stars. Historians still debate the extent to which these home setups allowed women to make original contributions versus simply following pre-established observations. But the passion and dedication behind these private observatories are undeniable. A mainstream fact here is that Caroline Herschel, a pioneering female astronomer from the earlier 19th century, set a precedent with her own observatory attached to her brother William's estate. Victorian women took inspiration from such figures, even if they lacked the grandeur of the Herschel estates. Here's a quirky detail: some women decorated their observatories with star charts and celestial motifs painted on the walls or ceiling, creating an immersive cosmic room atmosphere. One notable case involved a woman who installed a small star projector on her ceiling, projecting the constellations in a slow dance above her head, a Victorian planetarium of sorts, perfect for contemplative nights. You can imagine the delicate sounds in these rooms, the gentle ticking of a pocket watch used for timing star transits, the scratch of a quill on parchment, and the whispered breath of someone documenting a fleeting comet. These private observatories were places of solitude and profound focus, blending domesticity with scientific inquiry. The setup of such a space required balancing household responsibilities with the demands of astronomy. Some women had to work quietly at night after family had gone to bed, risking fatigue and frustration. Still, the very act of claiming this space was a statement, an assertion that their intellect and curiosity mattered. It's worth noting that not all home observatories were permanent. Some women used portable telescopes and carried them to secluded spots like hilltops or rural gardens, chasing clearer skies. The portability of instruments was a practical concern, but also a symbol of a restless quest for knowledge. One humorous anecdote describes a woman whose telescope repeatedly got tangled in the curtains of her sitting room, much to the bemusement of visiting guests. She reportedly quipped that the stars might be better seen from the lawn, but the sofa is much more comfortable. You begin to see how these private observatories blended the boundaries between public and private life science and art ambition and domesticity. In these intimate spaces, Victorian women forged their own celestial paths, guided by stars' candlelight and quiet determination. Letters, journals, and coded notes, the lifeblood of Victorian women's secret astronomical world. Imagine the soft rustle of thick paper as you unfold a letter written in elegant copperplate script, the scent of sealing wax, faint but distinct. These written exchanges carried the weight of discovery, gossip, encouragement, and sometimes frustration over being sidelined in a male-dominated scientific community. For many women, letter writing wasn't just social. It was a primary method of sharing data theories and observations. Victorian women's journals often contained detailed star charts, celestial event predictions, and personal reflections. Some entries were straightforward, but many were cryptic, using coded language or floral metaphors to avoid prying eyes, especially since letters might be read by family members or household staff. Historians still debate whether these codes were a necessary protection or an enjoyable intellectual game among like-minded women. A historical fact: prominent women astronomers, including Anne Walker and Mary Somerville, maintained extensive correspondence with each other and with male scientists, sometimes influencing published research through their letters. These documents offer rare insights into their scientific thought processes and social challenges. One quirky tidbit involves a letter exchange where star clusters were referred to as garden parties and supernovae as fireworks. This playful language helped protect sensitive information while fostering a sense of camaraderie. It's as if they created their own secret society, not just through meetings, but through carefully coded epistolary art. Some letters also contained hand-drawn sketches of celestial phenomena, including comets, lunar craters, and planetary surfaces. These illustrations were vital before widespread photography, and often showcased women's meticulous observational skills. You might picture a woman sitting by the hearth, quill in hand, crafting a letter to a distant friend detailing the strange dimming of a star, or the curious position of Jupiter's moons, wondering if anyone else had noticed. The time lag for responses, weeks or even months, made astronomy a slow but patient pursuit. Beyond personal letters, women contributed anonymous or pseudonymous articles to popular science journals and magazines. This written presence helped spread their ideas more broadly, even if their true identities remained hidden. The circulation of these publications created a network of knowledge that crossed social boundaries and geographic distances. An amusing example: one woman reportedly signed her letters simply as the Night Owl, delighting in the double meaning of staying up late to observe and being a wise if solitary scholar. These written communications were not just academic, they were emotional lifelines, offering encouragement during periods of doubt or social isolation. They helped maintain a sense of belonging in a community that largely existed underground. You see how the pen and paper became as important as the telescope for these women. Through letters and journals, they navigated a complex social maze, spreading knowledge and solidarity one carefully penned word at a time. You can almost hear the click and whirl of early photographic equipment as Victorian women pushed the boundaries of science by capturing the stars themselves, not just sketching, but immortalizing celestial bodies on glass plates. Photography was still a fledgling art, tangled with chemistry and patience. But it opened new doors for women astronomers who sought concrete evidence of their observations, rather than relying solely on the vagaries of memory or drawing skills. This era saw women increasingly engaging with astrophotography despite the technical challenges and social barriers. They experimented with telescopes rigged to bulky cameras, often in dimly lit rooms, redolent with chemical fumes from developing solutions. You can imagine the smell of collodion and silver nitrate mingling with the floral scents of a Victorian boudoir. A historical fact is that Mary Edwards, a British woman astronomer, was one of the early pioneers in astrophotography, successfully photographing the moon's surface in the 1850s. Her work, largely unrecognized in her lifetime, contributed significantly to the visual cataloging of lunar features. Historians still argue whether these early photographic endeavors were seen as legitimate scientific work or merely artistic curiosities, especially when conducted by women. The blurred line between art and science made acceptance even harder in a society eager to categorize women's contributions as ornamental or recreational. A quirky and fascinating detail is that some women developed elaborate sketches to complement their photographs, combining visual arts and scientific accuracy. One woman reportedly spent hours coloring lunar photographs by hand, bringing a painterly touch to otherwise monochrome images, a perfect blend of Victorian aesthetics and scientific rigor. Victorian women also used illustration skills honed from botanical art, another socially acceptable pursuit to render detailed star maps and planet surfaces. Their delicate hand-drawn diagrams often surpass the quality of some male counterparts, blurring the line between scientific documentation and art. You might chuckle imagining an evening where a woman half asleep and draped in a shawl tries to develop a photographic plate only to discover a smudge or a fingerprint, proof that even stargazing requires earthly patience. Photography also allowed women to share their observations in ways previously impossible. They sent plates across continents, enabling peer review and collaborative work that bypassed some of the barriers imposed by gender and geography. This visual evidence was crucial in pushing astronomy from a speculative hobby toward a recognized scientific discipline. It added an objective layer to observations, making it harder for detractors to dismiss women's contributions outright. The intersection of art and science in photography and illustration created a unique space for Victorian women astronomers to claim expertise. It was a subtle rebellion wrapped in beauty chemistry and optics. You start to appreciate that these early efforts in photography and illustration were not just technical achievements, but powerful statements, proof that women could master the complexities of emerging scientific technologies and contribute lasting knowledge about the cosmos. You settle in as the story shifts toward schooling, the quiet battleground, where Victorian women defied societal limits by becoming autodidacts, private pupils, and reluctant scholars of the stars. Formal institutions mostly barred women, but that didn't stop them from learning, often from the shadows of the family library or under the tutelage of discreet private teachers. Imagine yourself in a cramped sitting room surrounded by textbooks on mathematics, physics, and classical astronomy, some of which were dense enough to induce naps but essential to cracking the celestial code. Tutors were hired discreetly, sometimes young male graduates paid under the table, or family friends sympathetic to the cause. Women pored over logarithmic tables and star charts by candlelight, balancing their studies with the endless demands of Victorian domestic life. Historians still argue how effective this home-based schooling was, considering the lack of formal exams or credentials. Yet the results speak for themselves. Many women developed expertise rivaling their male counterparts, a quiet rebellion against the notion that women's brains weren't fit for mathematics or science. A historical fact: notable women like Agnes Clerk, though denied formal university education, became leading astronomy writers and critics through self-education and mentorship. Agnes's widely read works helped shape public understanding of astronomy for decades. Now here's a quirky detail: some women disguised their study notes in innocuous forms like pressed flower books or embroidery patterns to hide their true content from suspicious family members or tutors who might discourage unladylike pursuits. It was covert learning at its finest, like an intellectual spy thriller, but with compasses and sextants instead of codebreakers. Many Victorian women's educational efforts were supported by emerging scientific publications aimed at amateurs, which allowed learners to keep pace with new discoveries. These gentlemen's magazines often contained articles, star maps, and problem sets that women eagerly tackled, sometimes submitting their own solutions under pseudonyms. You might smile imagining a woman deep in concentration balancing a calculus problem on one hand while sipping tea with the other, determined to prove her competence. The cognitive dissonance of Victorian expectations was frankly exhausting. Tutors also offered mentorship in practical observation techniques, teaching women how to measure star positions, time eclipses, or record meteor showers with precision. This hands-on experience was crucial, turning abstract math into tangible connection with the cosmos. You can picture the thrill of discovery in these solitary study sessions, the quiet triumph of solving a celestial puzzle alone, even without the applause of a lecture hall. In this private schooling landscape, perseverance was as vital as intellect. Women balanced societal constraints with personal ambition, forging paths of knowledge through determination, clever disguise, and the occasional wink to a sympathetic tutor. You start to see education as not just acquiring facts, but an act of courage, rebellion, and hope, a secret constellation mapped out in the pages of hidden notebooks and stolen moments. The story takes an unexpected turn as you discover how Victorian women's expertise in botanical illustration, those delicate, precise drawings of flowers and plants, became a surprising bridge to astronomy. Picture a sunlit studio filled with pots of paintbrushes and sketchbooks, where a woman's practiced hand flits between petals and star charts, blurring the line between earth and sky. The skills needed to capture the intricate details of a rose petal translated beautifully to rendering the subtle variations in a star's brightness or the delicate shading of a lunar crater. Victorian society largely accepted botanical illustration as a suitable pastime for women. It was considered a genteel artistic pursuit, aligned with femininity. But some women cleverly used this socially approved skill to hone their observational accuracy and patience, essential traits for astronomical study. Historians still argue whether this crossover was intentional strategy or a fortunate coincidence that helped women circumvent educational barriers. A mainstream fact: Maria Mitchell, often regarded as America's first professional female astronomer, was also an accomplished botanical artist, demonstrating how these fields intertwined. Her precise eye for detail, trained on flowers, served her well when discovering a comet in 1847. You might chuckle at stories of women who, while illustrating exotic plants, became fascinated by the parallel challenge of mapping the stars, both requiring intense focus on tiny, complex details. Some Victorian women even annotated star charts with botanical metaphors, likening nebulae to clusters of petals or star clusters to bouquets. Another quirky tidbit is the use of botanical pigments to color-code star charts. Women borrowed inks from their botanical palettes, mixing natural dyes to highlight variable stars or planetary positions, resulting in charts that were as much art pieces as scientific tools. This intersection also had practical implications. The steady hand developed through detailed botanical work helped women accurately sketch lunar phases and sunspots, contributing to scientific records that were otherwise dominated by male illustrations. You can imagine a moment where a woman sets down her paintbrush from a leaf study and turns to a star chart, seeing familiar patterns in both the natural world and the heavens. It's a poetic link, drawing connections between the microcosm of flora and the vast cosmos above. At times, botanical and astronomical illustrations were exhibited side by side in salons or private galleries, subtly pushing viewers to reconsider women's intellectual range. It was a visual argument against the era's gender stereotypes, though one often overlooked by mainstream historians. You start to sense that this blend of botany and astronomy was more than coincidence. It was a quiet assertion that women's knowledge, no matter how disguised or layered, was valuable and interconnected. In the delicate strokes of brush and pen, Victorian women secretly charted a path that would eventually lead to greater acceptance in science, all while adhering to the strictures of their time. You now peek behind the grand observatory doors, where women who worked as assistants, often called observatory maids, carried out essential if unheralded tasks that kept Victorian astronomy ticking. Picture a chilly stone observatory with giant brass instruments and high-domed ceilings, where a quiet woman diligently records data, cleans lenses, or turns dials, her presence barely noted by the gentleman in charge. These women were the unsung heroes, their meticulous work underpinning discoveries credited to others. Historically, women like Caroline Herschel began as assistants to family members, but evolved into skilled observers in their own right. Victorian observatories often employed women as computers, human calculators who processed astronomical data long before machines existed. Despite their labor, these women rarely received formal recognition or payment, equivalent to men, reflecting the era's gender and class biases. Historians still debate the extent to which these assistants influenced scientific outcomes versus serving as mere laborers. Some argue their work was vital and collaborative, while others see it as overshadowed by the prestige granted solely to male astronomers. A quirky detail: in some observatories, female assistants developed nicknames for constellations or stars based on personal anecdotes or workplace jokes, such as calling a particularly troublesome star Old Grumble because of its unpredictable brightness changes. These informal names never made it into official records, but hinted a vibrant human side to their work. You can almost hear the rhythmic ticking of the chronometer, as these women carefully time star transits, the soft scratch of quills in logbooks, and the occasional whispered exchange about the latest celestial event. Their work required precision, patience, and dedication under often harsh conditions. Some observatory maids were multi-talented, contributing illustrations, calculations, and translations of foreign scientific texts. Their multilingual skills helped bridge communication gaps in an increasingly international field. Despite limited social status, a few rose through the ranks, earning respect and influencing younger women to pursue astronomy more openly. Yet their stories are often footnotes waiting for modern historians to uncover and celebrate. Imagine the quiet pride of a woman who, after hours of tedious observation, notices an anomaly, perhaps a new variable star or a comet's trajectory, and dutifully records it knowing her name will never headline a scientific paper, but feeling the thrill of discovery nonetheless. The work of observatory maids reminds you that science is rarely a solo pursuit. It's a mosaic of many hands and minds, some hidden in the shadows, but essential to the whole picture. You begin to appreciate how these women operating within the constraints of their roles laid critical groundwork for future generations of female astronomers to step into the light. You now slip into the lively world where Victorian women helped popularize astronomy, often writing under pseudonyms or anonymously for magazines, newspapers, and public lectures. Imagine cozy drawing rooms filled with ladies in flowing dresses exchanging the latest scientific news between sips of tea, while the wider public eagerly devoured these writings to glimpse the cosmos through accessible poetic language. Victorian popular science was booming, and women seized this opportunity to educate and inspire, albeit mostly in private or under veils of anonymity. Their articles ranged from explanations of eclipses to whimsical musings on the nature of the stars, often blending facts with a touch of Victorian romanticism to captivate readers. Historians still debate how much this popularization helped break down barriers versus reinforcing stereotypes by framing science as a genteel pastime. A mainstream fact Agnes Clerk mentioned earlier for her scholarly work also penned widely read popular astronomy books bridging the gap between academic science and public curiosity. Her writings helped shape how Victorians imagined the universe beyond their parlor windows. A quirky tidbit is that some women adopted playful pen names like Stellarina or the Nightingale Observer, crafting personas that made their science approachable while protecting their identities. Letters to editors reveal readers eagerly responded, sometimes unaware the author was a woman challenging societal norms. These popular writings often included elaborate star charts, guides for amateur stargazers, and explanations of new discoveries inviting the general public to join the cosmic conversation. Women writers became trusted guides in this expanding field. You can picture a woman preparing a public lecture in a modest town hall, balancing Victorian decorum with enthusiasm for the stars, encouraging her audience, mostly women and children, to look up and dream. These lectures were part science, part performance, and all heart. Sometimes the popularizing work was dismissed by professional scientists as mere entertainment, but it played a crucial role in building public support for astronomy, and indirectly women's involvement in the sciences. An amusing image: a pseudonymous female writer once signed off her article with a poem about a jealous moon hiding behind clouds, charming readers, and subtly mocking critics who doubted women's scientific seriousness. You start to feel how Victorian women's popularization efforts helped democratize astronomy, creating a shared language and excitement that transcended class and gender. Through their words and stars, they quietly broadened the universe for everyone, making the cosmos a little less distant and a lot more inviting. You now enter the thorny debate swirling around the labels amateur versus professional astronomer, a debate that Victorian women found themselves tangled in more often than they wished. Imagine a heated academic meeting filled with gentlemen in stiff collars debating the worthiness of observations made by someone who lacked formal credentials, or worse, by a woman. The term amateur wasn't just descriptive, it was a social barrier, a way to diminish the contributions of women, who often worked just as rigorously as their male counterparts. Historians still argue whether Victorian women were truly seen as amateurs because of genuine educational deficits, or if the label was a convenient excuse to exclude them from scientific recognition. Many women possessed the knowledge and skill of professionals but were denied official status due to entrenched gender biases. A mainstream fact is that the Royal Astronomical Society and other institutions explicitly barred women from membership well into the 20th century, solidifying the amateur status for decades. Yet women submitted detailed observations to these societies, through male colleagues blurring the lines between amateur and professional. One quirky detail is the story of a woman whose meticulous star catalog was repeatedly dismissed by a male committee as not fitting the standards of professional work, only for her data to later be validated and used extensively by astronomers. Her frustration was legendary among her circle, often humorously expressed as professional amateurs in letters exchanged with friends. You can imagine the tension as these women navigated a world where their dedication was unquestioned, yet their legitimacy was perpetually challenged. They often had to self-fund their work, teach themselves advanced mathematics, and maintain equipment, all without institutional support. The amateur label also carried social implications. Women branded as such risked being seen as dabblers, rather than serious scholars, reinforcing stereotypes about female intellectual inferiority. Yet paradoxically, the amateur status provided some freedom. Without institutional ties, women could pursue unconventional research work from home and focus on areas overlooked by professional male astronomers. This independence was both a curse and a blessing. You might smile at letters where women referred to themselves as hobbyists of the heavens, wielding the term with ironic pride, knowing their work was anything but amateurish. The debate over professional recognition highlights the broader struggle Victorian women faced, fighting not just for scientific inclusion, but for respect and equality in a rigid social order. You start to understand that these labels were battlegrounds with Victorian women astronomers, challenging the very definitions of expertise and authority. Their persistence paved the way for future generations to redefine what it meant to be a scientist regardless of gender. You now meet the Victorian women who broke through the shadows, those rare, brilliant figures whose secret astronomical work eventually pierced the veil of public acclaim. Imagine a bustling Victorian lecture hall, filled with curious eyes as a woman steps forward to share her discovery of a comet or a new star cluster. Her voice steady, despite the novelty of her presence in such a male-dominated space. One such pioneer was Williamina Fleming, who began her astronomical career as a maid before becoming a key figure at the Harvard College Observatory. Though her role was initially classified as computer, she identified over 300 new stars and variable stars, laying foundations that future astronomers built upon. Her story is a testament to talent prevailing against social constraints. Historians still argue how much credit these women received during their lifetimes versus posthumous recognition. Many faced invisibility, or had their work published under male supervisors' names, complicating their legacy. A quirky detail: Williamina Fleming's nickname among colleagues was the girl who saw the stars, a phrase both affectionate and patronizing, reflecting the era's contradictory attitudes toward women in science. Other trailblazers include Annie Jump Cannon, who refined star classification systems, and Mary Proctor, who popularized astronomy through writing and lectures. Their gradual acceptance marked a slow but meaningful shift in Victorian society's perception of women's capabilities. You can picture the mix of triumph and exhaustion these women felt, finally stepping into daylight, after years of working in shadows yet still navigating skepticism and prejudice. Their breakthroughs often inspired younger women to pursue astronomy more openly, breaking the cycle of secrecy and isolation. These pioneers leveraged self-education, mentorship, and sheer persistence to transform hidden talents into recognized contributions. At times, their discoveries sparked debates among scientists about the validity of women's work, challenging long-held assumptions. You might smile imagining a Victorian-era press headline reluctantly admitting that a woman had outshone her male peers, a small victory in a world slow to change. Through these stories, you sense a turning point where Victorian women's secret training blossomed into acknowledged expertise, shaping the future of astronomy. Their legacies remind you that sometimes the brightest stars emerge from the darkest nights. You're now drawn into the tangled web of gender and class, where Victorian women's ability to pursue astronomy depended as much on their social standing as their ambition. Picture an ornate drawing room filled with wealthy ladies discussing the latest star charts, while down the street, working-class women secretly study the skies by candlelight after long shifts. The intersection of gender and class shaped who could access education, equipment, and social networks necessary for astronomical study. Historically, upper and middle-class women had more leisure time, resources, and connections to pursue astronomy, often through private tutors' clubs or inheritance of scientific instruments. In contrast, working-class women faced harsher limitations. Though some, like Williamina Fleming, rose from humble origins through sheer determination and institutional opportunities, albeit rare. Historians still debate whether Victorian astronomy was predominantly an elite pastime for women, or if broader grassroots involvement existed but was underdocumented. The stories of observatory assistants and computers suggest a hidden working-class presence. A quirky detail: some working-class women reportedly used improvised tools like handmade sextants or repurposed lenses from spectacles to observe celestial events, highlighting ingenuity in the face of scarcity. You can imagine the frustrations of women constrained by their class, balancing demanding labor with a yearning for knowledge that often had no outlet. Social expectations also pressured upper-class women to conform to genteel roles, limiting how openly they could engage with science without risking reputational damage. Conversely, middle-class women sometimes faced scrutiny for stepping too far into intellectual domains, with critics accusing them of neglecting domestic duties. The class dynamic created a complex landscape where astronomy was both a symbol of privilege and a field where social boundaries could occasionally be crossed. You might smile imagining secret study groups, forming across class lines united by shared passion, but separated by society's rigid walls. Victorian women's navigation of these class and gender barriers reveals a layered struggle, one where access to the stars was as much about earthly social structures as celestial mechanics. You start to understand that their achievements were not only scientific, but also deeply social, challenging the era's strict hierarchies. In this tangled interplay, Victorian women astronomers forged paths that transcended their immediate circumstances, sowing seeds for a more inclusive future. You feel the tension rising as Victorian women navigated the fine line between societal expectations and personal ambition, especially when public acknowledgement threatened to unsettle the delicate balance of gender roles. Imagine whispered conversations behind lace fans, rumors swirling in parlors about a woman who dared publish scientific papers or attend lectures without chaperones. The stakes were high, as stepping too far into the public scientific arena risked damaging reputations and social standing. Women often used pseudonyms or male proxies to publish their work, a strategy born from necessity, but fraught with frustration. Historians still debate how much these tactics empowered women versus perpetuating their invisibility. A historical fact, the Royal Astronomical Society only admitted its first female members in 1915, decades after many women had been active contributors in the field, albeit unofficially. This institutional lag reflected the slow pace of social change. A quirky detail: some women reportedly attended scientific conferences, disguised in veils or incognito, blending into the crowd to hear lectures and exchange ideas without being singled out. It sounds like a Victorian sci-fi subplot, but it underscores their determination. Public lectures by women were sometimes framed as educational entertainments rather than serious science, helping soften public perception, while allowing women to share knowledge. These events often included dramatic star charts and poetic descriptions, bridging science and Victorian sensibilities. You can almost feel the courage it took to speak up in such environments, balancing the desire for recognition with the risk of social censure. Women also faced the challenge of balancing domestic expectations with their scientific pursuits, often working late into the night after household duties were done. The emotional toll was real. Letters reveal feelings of isolation, self-doubt, but also fierce resolve to continue. You might smile at the irony that the very restrictions designed to silence women sometimes fueled their creativity in finding new ways to contribute and communicate. Victorian women's public acknowledgement struggles highlight the societal gatekeeping that shaped scientific history. You start to see how these battles for visibility were as important as the scientific discoveries themselves. Their efforts laid groundwork for women's eventual acceptance as public scientists, slowly transforming the cultural narrative. You settle into the final stretch, the culmination of years of secret study, whispered theories, and stargazing through hidden lenses. The story now embraces the legacy these Victorian women astronomers left behind, the quiet revolution that rippled through science and society. Picture the night sky as a tapestry woven not only with stars, but with the perseverance and brilliance of women who refused to be invisible. By the dawn of the 20th century, many Victorian women had carved niches in observatories, scientific societies, and academia, sometimes under their own names, sometimes still veiled in anonymity. Their relentless efforts helped push astronomy toward a more inclusive future, inspiring generations of women to reach for the stars both literally and metaphorically. Historians still debate the full extent of their impact, often hidden beneath layers of institutional bias and lost records. But what's undeniable is the foundation they laid: a network of knowledge, mentorship, and passion that expanded the horizons of who could participate in science. A quirky and touching detail is the tradition some women started of naming newly discovered stars or asteroids after female family members, immortalizing their own stories in the cosmos. It was a personal signature written across the heavens. You can feel the fading echo of Victorian candlelight, mixed with the crisp glow of electric lamps, signaling a world moving toward modernity, but still carrying the traces of those earlier secret struggles. These women's stories remind you that progress is often slow, stitched together by countless small acts of courage and curiosity rather than sudden dramatic shifts. Their lives were a delicate balance of societal expectation and scientific passion, a dance beneath the same stars they studied. As you reflect, you realize that their legacy is not just in charts or telescopes, but in the very idea that knowledge belongs to all, regardless of gender or class. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. And now, as the stars settle into their endless orbits and the world quiets beneath the vast velvet sky, you can let your mind drift gently with the constellations. The journey you've taken through the secret lives of Victorian women astronomers is a quiet reminder of resilience, how even in the darkest nights, light finds a way to shine. You might imagine those women, candle flames, flickering pens poised over pages, eyes lifted to the heavens, daring to dream beyond the limits set before them. It's comforting to know that each of us carries a bit of that stargazer's courage within the curious spark that propels us to seek, to question, to discover. Tonight, as you close your eyes, picture the cosmos as a shared canvas, one painted not only by those who held titles or memberships, but also by those who in quiet determination mapped their own paths. The stars don't judge, they simply wait, constant and patient, inviting all to look up and wonder. Let that thought lull you gently into rest, a soothing hum that matches the fan's soft whisper in the background. Remember, the sky is vast, but so is your own capacity to dream, to explore, and to shine in your own way. Sleep well, knowing the universe is as welcoming as the night is deep. Sweet dreams.